So excited to have Cat with us tonight. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about composting, soil health, and climate change. So take it away, Cat.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here with Sustainable Woodstock. You guys do such great work, so thanks for inviting me. I'm going to try to talk about some really big subjects, and I'm going to try and get through it in about 20 or 30 minutes so that we can head into anticipated questions. And I welcome your questions about any of these subjects. So despite all of our accomplishments, yeah, we owe it all to soil. On the right-hand side, you're looking at a picture here of Iowa corn. This was taken, I'm pretty sure it was in the summer of 2019 by a friend of mine, Peter Donovan, who was the co-founder of the Soil Carbon Coalition, for which I serve on their board. And this was taken just right next to a river. So you can basically see this soil going away. It's as if the Dust Bowl never happened. And we can't blame farmers for making these decisions because they're stuck in an economic system that often encourages them to want to plant every single square foot of land they have to try and pay the bills. But this is a problem because we're losing our soil. We are in a global soil health decline. It can be a little depressing to really learn about all those facts, but I'm all about hope, so we're going to get there too, I promise. The United Nations reports to us that, and this was a few years ago, they let us know that if we continue treating soil as we are, largely in agricultural context, the way that we're doing agriculture on a large scale right now, we have 60 harvests left. 60. So that might not affect me in my lifetime, but there are certainly teenagers alive right now that are absolutely going to be affected by that. And it's our responsibility to learn how to take care of soil. And our greatest teacher is actually all around us. It's nature, and we're learning so much. Taking care of our soil is not only important because it's where we grow our food, and it's literally what holds our landscapes together. And it holds all biodiversity and all life, and we need it. It's also an important part of our hydrology cycle. So these are pictures that are familiar to Vermonters. The two on the left-hand side are after Tropical Storm Irene, and those are some of our farm fields. And also notice the color of that water. Which is brown, largely because of our farm fields and dirt roads. Farm fields that are covered in green growing plants year round wouldn't necessarily be affected by this unless they were right along the river's edge. On that bottom right, we're looking at a big puddle that was formed over a drain in a 2017 July 1st rainstorm that wasn't even predicted to be anything significant. But we experienced severe flooding in many towns in Vermont, including locally during that storm. And after Tropical Storm Irene, this famous picture was taken of Long Island Sound, and that's our Connecticut River there. Look at that color. That's our topsoil and our dirt roads. And this big figure of $800 million in infrastructure damage was certainly an underestimate, and had not one penny allocated for soil loss, which certainly has value, doesn't it? Sorry, my Zoom controls are not always so great. Soil is the glue that holds our landscapes in place. And within that soil are the living systems of the billions and billions of organisms that actually hold our landscapes in place. We need soil for everything. Soil is carbon. Carbon is the living, the dead, and the very dead. So by living, we're talking about the plants and the plant roots and all the organisms in the soil. And the dead, we're talking about the dead plant roots and the glomalin, which is what's left over after mycorrhizal fungus long goes away in terms of its life, but it leaves chitin, glomalin in the soil. The very, very dead is oil and fossil fuels, right? And coal. So Carbon is every living thing that ever was and ever will be. And in its gaseous form, it's carbon dioxide. And we need to draw that down back into the soil. I don't like to read my slides, so I know this is being recorded and you can check them out afterwards, or hopefully you've read through them by now. Soil is a sponge with the life in the soil. And when I'm talking about life in the soil, I'm talking about in healthy soil, you could have 10,000 in 1 teaspoon of healthy soil. You could have 10,000 bacteria, different kinds of bacteria, 10,000 species, hundreds of nematodes and protozoa, tens of thousands even, and miles of fungal hyphal strands. So the fungal hyphal strands are the tiny little filaments that are sent out by fungus in the soil. Some of those kinds of soil are saprophytic. Some of those kinds of soil are mycorrhizal. You may have heard that trees talk to one another. I highly recommend checking out Suzanne Simard's TED Talk about that very thing. And it's all about this life in the soil that's highly intelligent. And we can create the conditions for this soil life to thrive by following a simple set of soil health principles. These principles that you see in front of you, the top 4 were coined by the NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And the 5th one was coined by a man named Gabe Brown, who's one of my mentors. He's a North Dakota rancher, an amazing teacher. All 5 of these principles are very, very old. This is intuitive knowledge. These principles have been repurposed and they're backed by science, by the NRCS, but they're very simple in concept and they're very complex in their in managing them on landscapes, and it's very contextually different. So I think one important thing to note when you're thinking about these soil health principles is that they must all be viewed through the lens of your context. Do you live in the desert? Do you live on a sandy river bottom soil? Do you live on a clay hillside? Is it cold there, et cetera, et cetera. Living roots in the ground means living green growing plants for as long as possible. So 365 days a year, if possible. In our region, that means certain kinds of ground covers and ferns and evergreen trees. And our landscape likes to provide those for us. It doesn't mean that's all we need to grow. But when you have living green growing plants in the ground, you have the systems functioning to support all life. And we'll get into that a little bit. The second principle is maximizing diversity above and below the ground. This is everything from teeny tiny microorganisms below the ground and fungus to giraffes and zebras and cattle and crickets and anything that eats plant matter and poops it out is an important part of the animal portion of maximizing diversity, and anything that is a plant of any size, of any kind, of any height, of any structure is also important. And all of that together also attracts the kind of diversity we need in insects and birds and mammals and everything else. Minimizing disturbance, the third principle, is really focused on minimizing all kinds of disturbance, like chemical disturbance, from pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, also from chemical fertilizers, synthetic-based fertilizers. It's also talking about tillage, or anytime we dig into the soil. Whenever we dig into the soil, we're releasing carbon dioxide, and that's just something to know. The less times we can dig in the soil, the better. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I hope you ask me lots of questions about how to dig less. Minimizing bare soil is about mulching. It's also about those living roots in the ground, primarily. Whenever we can have a plant growing, that's what we want to do. Bare soil is letting carbon dioxide out. It's letting carbon out into carbon dioxide. It's evaporating water. The carbon dioxide that's coming out of the soil is actually dying life, because without that soil cover, all the systems are not in place to keep life going. So it turns into gas. The fifth one, animals in contact with soil, is all animals. It doesn't matter if you're vegan. We need poop. All animals poop. It doesn't matter if you're a grasshopper or a cow, we need you. And nature never farms without animals. On the right-hand side, I hope you've read the little bits where I'm trying to tie these principles to why compost is important in all of this. I'm not going to talk a whole lot of compost in this talk, but I hope you'll ask me a lot of questions about it. I do have other talks that are up on YouTube available for free that you can check out about composting. But the one thing I want you to understand about composting is that air is a really critical part of compost. All of the billions of organisms that can live in your compost pile need to breathe, and they also need a drink. So having the right amount of air and moisture in your compost pile is important. This little green and brown square on your screen is just giving an indication. If you think about all of the brown matter, the straw, the leaves, the wood chips, etc., if it could be structured in your pile like that, not that it's going to be that perfect, you're encasing all of your food scraps, nitrogen materials like poop and all those other things in a nest of carbon materials that is insulating them, both keeping heat in and moisture in. It is also providing lots of air for all of the organisms. You of course want to mix carbon materials in with the green matter as well. On the right-hand side, I'm just showing you two examples. On the top right, those are garlic stems in the bottom. So I always start my compost pile with about 6 to 12 inches of crisscross hollow stems like corn stalks or garlic stems or silphium plants or any kind of perennial plant stems that are hollow and are not going to cause you problems by growing from the stem. I use those on the bottom, and that's creating an air structure at the bottom of your pile that's going to feed your compost throughout its life of the filling point before you turn it. On the bottom, that picture, you're looking at what I like to call a donut and a donut hole. So right on top of that crisscrossed hollow stem structure, I place a donut of hay because that's what I have a lot of. It could be any number of carbon materials. And inside that donut hole is where I deposit my mixture of food scraps and carbon materials. Not having enough carbon is almost always the problem. Anytime I visit somebody's compost pile, whether you're a farmer managing large piles with the machine and rolling them, or whether you're a backyard gardener, almost every single time I show up with my compost doctor hat, it's because there's not enough compost, there's not enough carbon in the system. Microbes need sugar, and that carbon, that dry matter, not that it has to be physically dry when it goes in, it can be moist, but it's dead stuff. That is the sugars that are providing the organisms the energy they need to digest the proteins, which are largely your food scraps. Compost feeds the soil, and so do plants, so does sunshine, and all of this works together. So we can feed the soil by nurturing sunlight, and in the process, we're drawing down carbon dioxide in the form of life. The sun has an energy budget. For simplicity's sake, we're going to focus on that arrow that says 50% absorbed by the ground. And of that 50%, 40 to 60% of that is invested by plants into the root system selflessly. They're feeding microorganisms these sugars. One of my teachers, Dr. Elaine Ingham, likes to call these sugars the cakes and cookies. And these cakes and cookies are essentially liquid sunshine. So sunshine, this is photosynthesis, magically or scientifically turns sunlight into energy, into sugars that are then exuded through the plant system and down through the root system. And those are called exudates. Also, what's happening here is the hydrological cycle is working. So water is being moved through our system through these living plants and through their organisms. Through all of the sunshine and water movement and nutrient movement, we are also maximizing biodiversity, photosynthesis, and transpiration. This is a famous slide. I've seen it in so many webinars at this point, and I really do love it. This is a drawing of mostly southwestern prairie plants, but the gardeners in the room or on the screen will recognize some of these plants as echinacea and lupin and some of the wild mustards that are out there. And I like that it can highlight how deep roots can go. And this is really critical because those root systems are the feeding systems for microbes. And I'm going to explain that in a moment. Before I switch this slide, I always like to point out that red circle on the top left is pointing out your standard lawn grass. So as we get into talking about root systems and rhizospheres and microbial exchange and nutrient exchange, think about that picture of lawn grass in contrast with the depth of potentially up to 15 feet for many of these plants, of course, depending on whether or not there's bedrock in your soil. This picture is showing us a close-up of a root hair. So that would be a teeny tiny root hair, that brown in the middle. The blue zone around that root hair is a place that we call the rhizosphere. This is just an area about 1 millimeter or so wide around every single root hair where the soil life is most active. It's most active because the exudates, those cakes and cookies coming from the sun and the plants, are being sent through these root systems and exuded out into the soil, attracting organisms. The little red dots in here are indicative of bacteria and protozoa, other organisms in the soil, and the white lines coming in from the left and right are indicating fungal hyphae. One of the things that fungal hyphae, mycorrhizal fungus, are able to do is increase the rhizospheric space of a plant, including allowing plants to communicate among species and among each other in a forest. So on the left-hand side, you see a tree with the space that's indicated as the rhizosphere. And what's exciting is that the more that we're learning about soil microbiology and the highly intelligent systems in the soil, we're finding that that rhizosphere is a lot larger than we thought it was, because when you add in mycorrhizal fungus and the mycelium, we get much bigger. Some of the stars of the show that I'm talking about, these billions and billions of organisms, are depicted here on this slide, and that's also connecting them to the larger trophic scales. So this is the soil food web, which was really just identified as a food web in the 1990s. So this is really pretty new information. And some of what we're learning is that if you don't have the first, second, and third trophic levels all in your soil, you're not cycling nutrients. So for example, if you have highly bacterial soil and you don't have a presence of some of those larger organisms that eat bacteria and poop them out in the rhizosphere zone, those plants will not get the nutrients they need. So you also need to have the secondary and tertiary organisms. Well, wow, this can get really confusing. How do we count them? How do we know who's there? Well, you can geek out with a microscope, but you can also just follow those soil health principles by creating the conditions for maximized diversity and trusting that nature is going to follow suit and provide the conditions and all of the organisms that are there. So we have the ability to turn soil from this red block on the top left to the brown block on the bottom left. That's actually the same soil in the same region. The only difference is how that soil was managed on top. And that brown, that's the humates, that's carbon. That is carbon in the soil. That middle picture is taken at Butterworks Farm with Jack Laser holding up his own soil block. It was a wonderful moment for me. And we're looking at the soil aggregates that were available deep down in his soil, even after 2 months of drought in some of his pastures. And on the right-hand side, that is a picture from Nicole Masters, one of my mentors from New Zealand. And we like to call that the dreadlock soil. That's what we want soil to look like, those soil aggregates held together by the goos, glues, snots, and slimes that are produced by those billions and billions of organisms. Here's another example. This is Southern California, so we don't have grass like that here, but you can see on the bottom I don't know if you can see my mouse on the bottom, that's basically the color of this soil, and the humates that are being brought down from the organisms and from the plants, that's carbon, is actually changing the color of that soil. To give a little bit more of a visual of what's happening there, soil aggregates, as I mentioned, are, so they're like the little chunks of soil that are held on when you pull a plant out of the ground, and say you bash it against your leg a little bit, and there's still these balls of soil hanging on to the roots, and the roots themselves hopefully are also quite dirty. That's an indicator of very healthy soil. Those are being, that soil is being held to those roots by the goos, the glues, the snots, the slimes that are produced by all of the organisms in the soil. Those soil aggregates are also providing a huge amount of air and water space in soil, providing that sponge. This is helpful in breaking up compaction. Plants can actually break up compaction, and all along their root systems, these biological organisms work together brilliantly to cycle nutrients and sunshine and create these soil aggregates, providing structure, which then turns your soil into a sponge so that you can hold water during droughty times, which we're seeing more of. In the Northeast, we have a lot of rain. That's something that we have to worry about and be able to manage. This picture is from a very different part of the world in South Africa. This picture comes from the Alan Savory Archives. I highly recommend checking out Alan Savory and the Savory Institute. He does a lot of work in the restoration of grasslands. And what I just want to point out in this picture is the management on both sides of this fence are different, but the soil on both sides of the fence are the same. This is exactly the same soil. It's exactly the same environment. The only thing that changed is the way the land was managed. In this case, that was animals. So on the left-hand side, holistic grazing management was followed, which turned it from, it looked like what you're seeing on the right side, and in a matter of years, it turned it into what you're seeing on the left side. And on the left, carbon is being drawn down. We can see it in the form of those plants. We can imagine it in the darkness of the soil underneath those plants. Water is being drawn down. And on the right-hand side, we're losing both carbon and water. If you had bare feet and you were standing on either side of that fence, you would feel a very, very different temperature, as do all of the bugs and animals and microbes in that system as well. So diversity begets diversity, begets diversity, begets diversity. And I believe that's my last slide. And I want to open it up to Q&A. I do have a lot more slides that I can show if we start getting questions that are specific to garden. I do have some garden slides I can show showing how I do minimal tillage in my gardens, but let's go ahead and open it.
Well, actually, thank you so much, first of all, Kat. That was really great. I love those images. You've got some really good images there to kind of show what you're talking about. What you just said about talking about no-till in the garden might be very relevant to a question we have here. Amy is asking, you say not to disturb the soil. Does that mean the soil in my vegetable garden does not need air? I have a cover crop on my vegetable plot. How deep can I turn the cover crop into the soil without disturbing it too much? So a question about cover cropping and I guess tilling as it relates to that.
Yeah, okay. So the air comes into your soil through plants. It's something new that we're learning, that it used to be thought that we had to put air in the soil and turn it over. Actually, when we do that, we create compaction. So how does that work with cover crops? It works in a lot of different ways depending on the scale that you are and the kind of cover crop. So I'm curious about what kind of cover crop was grown. I like to advise people whenever possible to grow annual winter kill cover crops, which means that the frost will kill them. And then in the spring, you have a bunch of dead plants on top of soil that you can plant directly into. If you're planting perennial rye, then you're going to have to till it. Absolutely. Because if you don't, it's going to grow really, really tall as soon as it might already start. It might have already started. So I don't know if we can get any clarity on what kind of cover crop, but some of the ones that I like to promote for early planting, and I just want to put the note in there that it's tricky because we want to fill our spots with vegetables. But if we're really interested in soil management, we need to be thinking about how to feed the soil. And that includes minimizing the amount of time that soil is bare. So I like to use oats, field peas, brassicas of any kind. So those are your mustards and Brussels sprouts and broccoli. It's a great way to use up old brassica seeds. You can mix them all together and then use them as a cover crop. Brassicas tend to have pretty deep tap roots too, so they can also help to break up compaction. They're a wonderful pest trap crop as well. Flea beetles love them. You might be able to trap them all there. Buckwheat is another one that I use. Sudan grass, annual rye, some of the wheats. So that's just a small selection to start with.
Okay. And I'll keep an eye to see if
One more thing. There was a question. She asked how deep to go. Ideally, just try and kill the plant. If it's perennial rye, then any roots are going to be exposed and you're going to have to flip them a couple of times. Go as shallow as you possibly can, but don't feel bad. It's okay.
oh, there's an update. The cover crop is winter rye.
Oh boy.
Yeah, so can I till 4 inches or so was the follow-up.
Yeah, you can till 4 inches or so, and you might have to do that twice because it might want to start growing back after the first one. And I know that's a popular cover crop, and it is challenging. A lot of farmers unfortunately use herbicide to kill winter rye, and I'm definitely not going to recommend that.
Yeah, you hear that a lot, that farms need herbicides to kill cover crops. At least I've heard that a lot. So we have another question from Mary, it looks like. In my raised beds, I'm used to adding compost, organic soil, and turning it all together. In raised beds, what should we be doing for best results?
So I just add on top. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again because I have a couple of slides on raised beds. That's a clover root, by the way. That's my lawn. So raised beds. Here's an example. This is just what I do. I like to just keep piling it on top. The reason I have so much space in this bed of wood is because I actually have a glass top so that I can get a little bit of season extension. So there's plenty of room also to build the soil up. So the first thing I do, this is what my bed looked like in April 2018. First thing I did is I went and I harvested the dandelion greens and I ate those. And then I potted up. I have Johnny jump ups and forget-me-nots. I try to choose the weeds that go in my garden, and these are lovely weeds and they're great ground covers. So I potted those up to give those away, and that left me with an area that looked like this. And so then I took scissors and I cut right to the ground. And then I made furrows. So you can see this is all just ground litter on the top. I just cut it. I dug furrows. I put compost in those furrows. I planted my seeds. I put a light mulch, and then I had seedlings, 7 to 10 days later, of course, depending on what you're planting. And this is what it looks like on top. So that green area is still just left there. And that was a kale. I actually ended up getting quite a bit of kale off of that. And so these areas that look like they're tilled, they're not tilled. I cut and then I added compost on top so that the seedlings would have a chance to come up. And that's about how much hay I put on there. And then throughout the growing season, I kept harvesting Johnny jump ups and dandelions. And when other plants would get too close, I would pull them or cut their head off. And that's about it. So I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, I really love the pictures you've got. You put a lot of effort into it, I can tell. We've got someone who maybe isn't from Vermont here, what would you, what is some advice to grow food living in New York City, Manhattan? Could I grow a box on a roof?
Oh, yes, you can. Absolutely. If you have a window, you can grow a window box. They have these great grow bags now. I mean, I'm not a big fan of a lot of the plastic stuff, but I'm very fortunate that I live on open land. So I don't have to do that. If I lived in the city, I would definitely be growing up every wall and rooftop I could. So yes, you can. The quality of your soil is going to make a difference, and all plants are going to need some food. So find some good, like a fish and kelp-based soil amendment is, or not a soil amendment, a plant food is really good to keep them healthy. Absolutely, they're great resources on urban gardening out there, and bravo for trying.
Great. I'll go down another. If one has been gardening with conventional rototilling practices and wants to start using no-till, what steps should someone take this spring to get started?
Really good question. I'm gonna say, depending on how big your area is, start small. You know, maybe don't do the whole thing this year. If you have a 10 by 100-foot garden or something like that, if you've got small spots, um, mulch is the way to go. So you can do a lot by choosing the plants that are allowed to grow in your gardens. I'm going to share my screen one more time because I have another example here um, of garlic. So this is where I grew my garlic. This is just a small patch. In my garlic, I also let grow wild strawberries, a perennial ground cover plant called lamium, a wild sorrel, which kids like to call cowboy candy, the little sorrel heart-shaped leaves. Occasional dandelions, Johnny jump ups, all of that. And when I planted, all I did was I cut with scissors right down to the ground. I poked the garlic in, and then you can see it coming up in May just fine. And throughout that entire summer, I added a little more mulch. If any plant got too tall, I cut it down, and I got really beautiful garlic. So one thing I want to encourage is an understanding that plants actually are really amazing collaborators with one another, but it's important to think about what you're growing. If you're growing carrots, they don't want any competition at all. They want bare soil. That's one place where I'm gonna till the soil a little bit with my fingers, and I'm gonna make sure that those seeds get a nice bare soil to go on. Larger seeds are easier to grow with other plants, and transplants are easier to grow with other plants. When you're trying to prepare your space in the spring, I'm just going to assume that you're starting with a bare space. I would get it covered right away with mulch, and then start planting into it as you go. If it is covered in grass or a cover crop or weeds right now, cut them. Just cut them down and dig a hole where you're going to plant your plants. See what happens. Use mulch to cover the weeds. What weed seeds need to germinate is contact with soil and sunlight and water. So if you can prevent those conditions from happening, your weeds aren't going to sprout. Um, it's not necessarily an easy transition, but it's well worthwhile. And full disclosure, I think it's important for people to realize, at least in my experience, when I started doing no-till, my yield of food went down a little bit, but my yield of insects, good ones, went up. My yield of appreciation for my garden went up. My labor went down. That a need for watering went down. It's incredible. I highly recommend it. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, and if there are follow-up questions, please type them in the chat here. Our next, I'm just going down by order of who asked a question. So in the wild perennial areas, phlox, daisies, lilies, ivy, fern, should I be adding compost, and if so, when?
If you have extra to add, yes, go ahead and just throw it on, like scatter it on literally take a shovel and just kind of like throw it up there and let the plants sort it out, and let the organisms work it down into the soil. All plants will benefit from additional compost. And it's also worth noting that in your gardens, when you clear your gardens in the spring, or in the fall rather, it's really best to just come in with head shearers and clip, clip, clip. I clip like every 6 inches and let it all drop down and let it compost in place. My days of carting to the compost pile and then bring it back, over. I use that all as mulch. So yes, all your perennials love compost. If you have enough, definitely share it anytime.
Great. Dandelion question. If dandelions grow in our vegetable raised beds, we should just cut off the heads and not worry about pulling out the deep root, is the question. So how to deal with dandelions?
So yes, if you can manage it. If my dandelion is growing too close to what I want it to grow, I'm going to take the whole thing out. But I know that that dandelion root is deep and it has lots of side hairs coming off of it. And when I do pull those roots out, I always look, is it clean or is it dirty? If it's clean, it's telling me I don't have any biological activity or much to speak of in my soil. If it's dirty, I do. So sometimes I leave them and I'll pull them out like every other month, just sort of check on the soil health. If they're in the way, get rid of them. Dandelions are also incredible medicine, great tea. The leaves are delicious. So I would recommend incorporating them, but don't allow the dandelion to be a struggle for you.
Don't let the dandelion win. Let's see. I have a brand new garden starting on a town lot where there were high lead levels, 575. I don't know what that means personally. I removed the top layer of soil and put wood chips over everything to stop blowing lead dust. What would you suggest?
Oh gosh, I wish I had a better suggestion than a raised bed on top of that. I want to learn more about remediation, phytoremediation, which is just being able to pull lead out of soil with plants, or mycoremediation with mushrooms. And you can also, there's also some remediation that can happen in compost, but we're not very good at it, and we're certainly not well researched about it. So I am definitely concerned about plants taking up that lead. We know that they can do that, which is why we want to know how we can use phytoremediation, but that also means it's going to get into the plants that you're consuming. So a raised bed is what I've seen most people do in terms of lead management, I guess. It's not managing, it's building on top of. Especially important if you're growing root crops in the ground. You definitely want to have some tall raised beds on top of that. So for resources on that, I might send you to the Vermont Community Gardening Network. I'm suspecting they might have some information, because I know that a lot of community gardens have had situations where they have contaminated soil that they're building on, and so they do raised beds. Other than that, promote research, funding for research, so that we can figure this stuff out.
Christine, I skipped your question and I see that. When starting a new bed, is it good to lay down cardboard to kill the grass?
Yeah. Yep, sure. Underneath like a raised bed, I assume you're asking. But cardboard is great for all sorts of things. I use cardboard around tree circles and then put mulch on top of them. I use cardboards to start brand new garden spaces. I use thick cardboard to take care of plants like goutweed that I'm trying to manage. And I have had some success with that. One thing to consider is that cardboard is dry when you're putting it down. So in terms of not wanting to interrupt the microbial movement in the soil, you might want to just make sure that your cardboard gets nice and moist so that you don't create a layer of compaction or something like that. But cardboard goes away pretty quick. Also, remove the tape.
That's a good point. This question appeals to me as well because I've got some blueberry bushes I'm trying to revive. About blueberries, mulched with wood chips and compost, would you pull dandelions, violets, etc., or are these happy companions? What about when grass encroaches on the blueberries?
Happy companions, all of them, including grass, although, you know, you have to be careful because grass will become a lawn if you let it. The thing to note, though, is grass likes pretty poor soil, and it does like acidic soil, which also blueberries like. We have at Thetford Elementary School, where I have a school garden, we have what we call Blueberry Hill. We have 8 or 9 blueberry bushes on a hillside that is completely covered in a mixture of creeping Charlie, cranberries, low bush cranberries, wild strawberries, dandelion, Johnny jump ups, and forget-me-nots.
I'm going to be selfish and ask a follow-up question for myself. I'm trying to resurrect blueberry bushes that are completely surrounded by grass and it was killing them. So I had to cut it down quite violently in the fall. Would you pull it up? Would you put mulch down around it and try and kill it?
Yes, I would. Depending on how compacted that soil is, I would consider removing the sod and turning it upside down
Oh, that's a good
so
idea.
that you don't lose all of the organisms that are in that grass. Turning it upside down and then putting mulch on top of that. If it's not super compacted, then I would consider just making sure that you put some, like, stab the ground a little bit, and then, yeah, cardboard and mulch right on top of it. Removing the grass is removing a lot of the nutrients. So, and it's a lot of work.
Yes, it is. No, that's a good
Yeah,
point.
but I do think that blueberries would prefer not to be right up to their neck in grass.
Yeah. Um, Someone came in from Scotland. Hello, that's fun. Any ideas about dealing with hay-scented ferns that give off a toxin which kills anything nearby and is creeping into my perennial beds?
Ooh, sounds like you have an issue with that one. um, I haven't had a particular issue with hay scented ferns, but I know it's similar with the simple fern and quite a few other ferns. They grow on these big sort of corum type things under the ground. So what I would do is just try and uh, get it out, you know, pull it back. Just like I do this with certain aggressive plants, like mint, for instance, or certain ferns. Maybe every few years I'll say, "All right, you've reached your border, and I'm gonna trim you back now and give you a few more years to figure it out." So you might try, in that case, actually removing the plant, and depending on where it is, you could also try mulching heavily on top and say, "Take that."
Great. Um, do we need to worry about toxins that are in cardboard or newsprint if we're using that in gardens?
In my research, I have seen that no, it is not an issue. Um, I don't use cardboards with really waxy, shiny print on them. I remove tape. It actually, the glue is the fungals like the glue in cardboard. Um, I I wouldn't worry about it. At this point, most newspaper and cardboard inks are all soy based, and any research I've done has not proven any problematic issues. Again, it is another place where there isn't a lot of research done on the cocktail of chemicals that might appear through waste, PFOAs, and et cetera. So I don't want to make any blanket statements like, oh, cardboard is great. But I do use it and I'm careful about where I use it from. And of course, you wouldn't want to use like cardboard that was, um, you know, carrying like powdered chemicals or something like.
That makes sense. If you have a picture of a Johnny jump up, someone's asking what they are, the person from Scotland, if you happen to have it.
Oh, I don't know if I do, but I bet you would know them as a viola. So they're a little viola, like a pansy flower. And around here, they're the one flower you could actually find in the middle of winter. in some places. So it's the last to go and the first to come. They tend to be very purple with a little smiley yellow face, and they're edible, the flowers.
That's a beautiful description. My husband is a woodworker. Can the sawdust from his sanding be used as mulch and in compost?
Definitely in compost. The kind of wood matters. If it's pressure treated, the answer is no. But otherwise, hardwood, softwood doesn't matter one bit. In terms of compost, absolutely. In terms of mulch, I would mix it if you were going to use it as a mulch, depending on what you're using it for. Tends to be a very acidic um, product, sawdust, so maybe around blueberries or raspberries. The other thing is that because the particle size is so small, um, it could cause problems with the way that water moves through that area. So mixing it might just give a little more option there. But yeah, I use sawdust. And none of it goes to waste. It goes into mulching and it goes into compost. Absolutely.
Um, can we use shredded copy paper with, oh dear, I don't know this word. Okay, can we use shredded copy paper with the concomitant inks in our compost or as mulch? I don't know that word.
I don't know what that means with the inks, but shredded copy paper, copy ink generally also is totally fine. I use it all the time. I feed it to my worms. I use it in my compost. Shredded paper is great. We use it in our school compost too. And it's really airy. So it's already got that nice sort of fluff to it at first until it gets wet.
Great. That's a cool question. Without spending money, how can I obtain raw materials to improve my soil, both vegetable garden soil, but also other areas that have been poorly managed? I would love wood chips, old hay, manure, anything free, really.
You are so on the right track, and that's exactly how I operate. And if you live around us, I know we had somebody call in from the city, so that's a harder place. But even there are food scraps that people are trying to get rid of. You're looking at people's waste streams, and you're saying, "How can I take that from you?" And usually, people are willing to give it to you. So yes, landscaping companies, leaves, things like that. One caution, of course, is that some people like to use pesticides on their lawns. And so getting long clippings and leaves from other people might bring in residues into your compost system, which may or may not cause you issues depending on what those are. Another area that we need a lot of research on. So landscaping companies, tree companies, your town garage, if they're taking down trees or anything like that, your town listserv. Absolutely. The town green usually needs to be raked. Who's getting those leaves? Food scraps from restaurants are often available. And sometimes you could even go to a horse farm and say, hey, especially if you offer to muck out the stall. Yeah.
Those are fun ideas. Where do you get your mulch, Cat? Like the majority of it, do you produce it yourself?
I do. So most of my mulch comes from either hay or leaves. I rake them up and I just put them in piles and let them break down. And as I've started no-till and doing that choppy chop with every six, like head shearers, I really have had a much less of a need for mulch because my garden produces its own mulch. But when I plant trees out in the community, I'm using wood chips that I'm usually buying in from one of our local businesses. So if I'm on my own land, I'm always finding my own free stuff that just falls all around me, or making my own compost, which I also use as mulch. But
Mhm.
out in the world, when I'm doing projects, I'm typically trying to support local businesses that are producing those.
Great. What do you mix with sawdust for mulching?
So that would depend on what you were using it for. Since it would be a better mulch for raspberries or blueberries or any acidic crops like that, roses is another one. They all like similar um, blueberries like especially acid. So in that context, I would say mix it with pine needles and some shredded leaves, maybe some wood chips if you have those too, and mix those all together. And that way you're getting the particle size difference. And this would also be true in a compost pile. So I showed that one slide about the carbon materials and how important those are for air. I want to invite you to think about a diversity of those materials. And if you put them all in a wheelbarrow and kind of mixed it up, how would they land? And what is the natural airspace between those particles? That's important. So the same is true with your mulch. And I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that was good for me to hear for my blueberries. Any suggestions for getting rid of Japanese beetles?
Yes, but not rid of. We can't get rid of them. They're important. They're supposed to be here. They're part of the food chain. But there's a lot of things that we can do to make our land less inviting to them and more inviting to their predators. So the first thing I want to say is to look up what is called the tachinid fly, Tachinid. And those are flies that are native to our region, and they lay eggs on Japanese beetle heads. So when you are, this is one of my favorite things to do with kids, go look for Japanese beetles, find the ones with the eggs on their head area, and you leave them because those have been infected with the tachinid fly. And pretty soon that beetle is going to fall to the ground and larvae is going to come alive inside that beetle and eat it. And it's so cool. So providing an ecosystem where you have balanced, diverse insects and birds is really the best way to manage Japanese beetles. Another best way is to not have large areas of only food that they like roses and blueberries and raspberries. And if you do, then to use some interventions like pheromone traps or children to go pick beetles or many other things. I hope that that's helpful. I know they can be a real challenge, and they do cycle. So some years they're more of a challenge than others. There is another recommendation I can give is that you can buy soil nematodes that are specifically they specifically eat the larvae of Japanese beetles and also rose chafer beetles. And if you put that in your lawn, they can live for up to 7 years or so in the right conditions. But you do need to do your research and make sure that you're putting that out on the right kind of day, et cetera. I don't want to get too detailed there, but so I hope that's helpful.
I'll call out that it's 6:27. Cat does have to leave at 6:30, but I'm going to try and get some more in. I've always been told to remove all debris at the end of the year because of fungus or overwintering bugs. Will this happen?
So that's an interesting question. And I know I was taught the same thing, but even when I did that, the fungus and bugs were there and not the good ones. So what I was doing was removing the food and habitat for all other beings, and eliminating diversity and biodiversity in my yard. So the only things that were really there were either the vegetables I wanted or the things that wanted to eat them. So now by diversifying my landscape, minimizing my destruction of soil, inviting weeds to flower, which are partnering with native insects and have been for eons, I'm finding less and less problems, and I hope that you do as well. One thing though I will say is if you have a heavily diseased plant like a tomato that's been blighted, tomatoes are one thing that I will sometimes remove just the top. I leave the roots in the ground. I do.
So, but you remove blighted plants?
Yeah, for blighted plants, I'll remove them and I'll put them in like a separate, you can call it a compost pile, but a pile I'm never going to go into. Sort of my disease or problem plant compost.
That's fun. Well, this is perfect, actually. I think we've just finished all of our questions and it's 6:29.
Yay.
So that is like amazing. And lots of thank yous you're getting in the chat if you want to take a quick look.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
I
very,
love talking about bugs and plants and soil.
yeah, I get the sense you could do it forever. So, uh, yeah, thank you, Kat. I could listen to you forever and still learn. Yeah, lots of really sweet comments. So
Aw.
yeah, I'm so happy you got a chance to join us for our green drinks. And I know you do have to go, but just so everyone knows, people who came on late, I'll be sending a follow-up email with anything Kat wants to share, maybe links to her website or things like that, and a link to the recording of this event so you can go back and watch it and share. So thank you all so much, and thank you so much, Kat.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Thank you, Kat.
Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Nice to see you.